I'm not as young as I used to be, which means I can't treat my body the way I once did. In fact, last year's medical checkup didn't turn out the best, so I decided I needed to change things up and start eating healthier. One of the ways I do that is by making smoothies. But smoothie shop prices can be pretty high, and making them at home always seem like a pain. You gotta pull the blender out, find the right attachments, set everything up, and then cleaning everything is annoying, making it difficult to quickly whip up a breakfast smoothie in the morning. That's why I'm glad to tell you about the BlendJet 2 portable blender. Like I said, it's portable, so you can blend up a smoothie at work, a protein shake at the gym, or even a margarita on the beach. It's small enough to fit in a cup holder, but powerful enough to blast through tough ingredients like ice and frozen fruit with ease. BlendJet 2 is whisper quiet, so you can make your morning smoothie without waking up the whole house. That's especially important to me because I wake up before the rest of my family, and once my kids are up, my morning work routine is pretty much shot to hell. And best of all, BlendJet 2 cleans itself. Just blend water with a drop of soap and you're good to go. BlendJet 2 has over 30 plus colors and patterns to choose from, so if you don't like one design, there's definitely one that suits your personality. So what are you waiting for? Go to blendjet.com and grab yours today. Be sure to use my promo code SuperCinemaPod12 to get 12% off your order and free 2-day shipping. No other portable blender on the market comes close to the quality, power, and innovation of the BlendJet 2. They guarantee you'll love it or your money back. Blend anytime, anywhere with the BlendJet 2 portable blender. Go to blendjet.com and use my code SuperCinemaPod12. That's SuperCinemaPod and the numbers 12 to get 12% off your order and free 2-day shipping. Shop today and get the best deal ever.
Charles Xavier, have you come to rescue me?
Sorry, Eric, not today.
To what do I owe the pleasure?
The assassination attempt on the president. What do you know about it?
Nothing. Only what I read in the papers. You really shouldn't have to ask, Charles.
What's happened to you?
I've had frequent visits from William Stryker. You remember him, don't you?
William Stryker.
His son, Jason, was once a student of yours, wasn't he?
Yes, years ago. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to help him. At least not in the way that his father wanted.
And now you think that taking in the Wolverine will make up for your failure with Stryker's son. You haven't told him about his past, have you?
I put him on the path. Logan's mind is still fragile.
Is it? Or are you afraid of losing one of your precious X-Men? Old friend.
Eric, what have you done?
I'm sorry, Charles. I couldn't help it.
What have you told Stryker?
Everything. The war has begun.
Welcome to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine. And some of you may know, but up until about a year ago, I was working on a podcast project with two other guys. We were doing a complete read-through of Grant Morrison's new X-Men run. And we wrapped up about that about a year ago. Had a lot of fun doing it. And both of them are here with me today to talk about X2. And that is Patrick Lagua and Oscar Owens. Guys, how you doing today?
I'm good. Nice to be back. Good to see you again, Harry.
Yeah, it's really good to see you guys again. I'm excited to talk about X-Men with you boys.
Yeah, same here. I'm really looking forward to it. This is something I've been hoping we could, ever since we ended the show, like I said, floated the idea past you guys, and you were both keen on it, and then just time came up, and just like it became one of those things that was just kind of like dangling out there, like an X-Men plot thread. So then, as I was making plans for a new episode, I'm like, I should really talk to them and see if we could sort out logistics and get everybody's schedules in. So I'm really glad we were able to work everything out.
Um,
But before we jump too much into the movie, what I like to do is ask people, especially returning guests, what kind of thing are you into lately? It can be comic books, movies, TVs, anything that's kind of like capturing your interest right now. Pat, how about we start with you?
um, I mean, I'm still loving the crop of Xbox that are coming out. Um, I've been playing a lot of the Resident Evil 4 remake. I think I'm on my third playthrough of that right now.
Oh, wow.
I have Well, the novelty now is like I have Leon wearing all the kinds of weird costumes that are in the game. So now I make him look like a 1920s gangster type, which is one of the variant costumes. So it's just really amusing just to have him walking around the Spanish village dressed up as like a 1920s gangster. It makes me very
I,
happy.
I do that with I've got the Dead Rising games or what is it? I can't
Hmm.
remember exactly the name offhand, but I've got the fourth one of that and just like dipping in and out of it here and there. And I've got the definitive edition, so it's got all the different costumes and looks, so you can just play around with those. And yeah, that's a lot of fun too. Oscar, how about you? What is grabbing your interest these days?
Look, I'm obsessed at the moment with jury duty, which is not comic
Is that a
related, but it
game?
kind of
Is that a
is because it
game?
has James Marsden in it. But
Okay.
I am, as someone who went to law school, like, I think that kind of hits into it as well. But it seems like the perfect amalgamation of The Office, The Truman Show,
Hmm.
and Punked, all put in together. And I think the whole world right now is like everyone seems to, it's like gone viral, but everyone seems to have just fallen in love with the guy that's getting punked, Ronald. He just seems like the the sweetest, kindest, nicest, coolest guy. And yeah, I'm obsessed with it. It's great. I don't know how they're going to do it again. They're going to have to try and come up with some other way to recreate the magic and catch the lightning in the bottle. But yeah, Jury Duty. If you haven't seen it, watch it.
Oh,
I've never even heard of
is
this.
that on
What
Freebie, Oscar?
I haven't heard of it. Oh, okay, so it's what it is they've got, it's like a reality show, and they've got a trial, like a civil litigation. This woman's suing one of her old employers, and there's a judge, there's a jury, there's a bailiff. The jury is sequestered, but the trick is that everyone is an actor except for one juror. And James Marsden is one of the jurors that gets called in, and he plays like a
There's an
exaggerated
extra
version of
connection.
himself.
So, yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, and one of the very first scenes, he's like walking in and he sits down, and they've orchestrated it so that when Ronald, his name is, when Ronald comes in, he sits down on a chair, and then James Marsden comes and sits next to him, and somebody asks James for like a selfie, and James starts to talk to him, and he's like, "Yeah, I was just in I was in like the Sonic movie," and this guy Ronald's like, "Oh, I heard that movie was shit," and James
Mm,
Marsden's like, "Oh," like inside you can see he's like cut a little bit, but on the other side he's like, "Oh
mm,
yes, this is gonna be like magic,"
mm,
and yeah, he keeps saying that people keep calling him like the X-Men boy, and
mm.
um, this crazy stuff happens within the the trial, which is completely outrageous. And this poor guy sort of gets strung along, and yeah, it's really good. It's well worth a watch.
I'll have to see if I can find it somewhere. My thing is, I just picked up it's the Superman Legacy sale, so I just picked up a bunch of Superman books for the 85th anniversary, and one of them was, I was just talking to Pat before you came on. I just finished reading Son of Kal-El book 2. Tom Taylor's doing that, and it was such a great read. I really enjoyed digging into that. Um, that's the big thing for me now. Also, we've got new episode of Succession that I still have to watch. And I also just wrapped up Beef. I'm not sure if you guys saw that on Netflix, but that was
I
really entertaining.
I enjoyed Beef thoroughly. I thought it was great.
Beef is definitely on my to watch list. I haven't got there yet, but it's definitely on my to watch list.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad my wife suggested it because I'd seen it and I'd been hearing little rumblings of it here and there, but I hadn't actually sat down and started watching it. But she came home one day and she's like, "Let's watch Beef. I heard it's really good." And I was hooked like from the first episode, and we just like
Mhm.
binged the whole thing in a week. Because I don't do a lot of binging these days. It's like, watch one episode here, one episode there, but just with kids and work and everything, I barely have the time. But this, we made time for because it was that good.
That's a pretty big, pretty big appraisal then.
Yeah, I mean, I think so, at least. Anyway, today, like I mentioned, we are talking about X2, the 2003 sequel to the first X-Men movie. And this is a movie that I've been wanting to cover for a while, and it's one of those big gaps we have on this show. Like, we've covered done 150 plus episodes now, and every now and then I'll look over the list of movies that we haven't done, and I'll see like there's a big one that I'm surprised nobody has requested. The Dark Knight is one of them, and X2 is another one. It's one of those big holes that's been in there for a long time, and I'm glad I could finally get you guys on to talk about it. Before we dive too much into the movie as a whole, let's talk a little bit about when it first came out, because I'm probably correct in assuming both of you guys saw it when it first came out. So what do you remember thinking about it at the time?
I was just so excited because I think all the media buzz around it that I read before it came out just talked about how it's so much bigger and better than the first one. And I mean, to be fair, the bar was pretty low in that regard to like improve on the first film. Um, so I was really excited, and I think it delivered on all counts. And I remember it was back during the time where there were still such things as dollar movies. I don't know if that's a thing either of you can recall, but
Oh yeah, I recall that.
so that's sort of, I think I saw that film in the theaters at least maybe 10 times because there were dollar movies.
Oscar, how about you?
Well, I've never heard of a dollar movie. What is a dollar movie?
It's just what it sounds like. But it's not first run films, so they would show like films that have been out for a while and maybe not showing in a first run theater, and then you just pay a dollar and you see a movie.
Usually like smaller theaters, older theaters. It's like after the movie's been out for 2 or 3 months, then it'll come to these dollar theaters.
Oh, okay.
And it's like
I went to
they've got like the old style crappy seats and all that kind of stuff.
I went to see recently, just before the Oscars, I went and saw Everything Everywhere All at Once for $5. So maybe that's like a 2023 version of a dollar movie.
Probably, yeah.
Maybe, yeah.
That was a great film, by the way, and it's even I think a bit superhero-y as well.
It hasn't. I think it's just come out in the theaters here. So, and I'm not sure if it's got English subtitles or Japanese subtitles, because with movies here, sometimes they'll have the English subtitles and Japanese subtitles for foreign language scenes. Sometimes they won't. So, so I'm waiting a little bit longer to get it on video.
For me, I think it was the best film I've seen in the last 10 years. It was fantastic. But when X-Men 2 came out, unlike Pat, I loved the first one. I was really nervous when I watched it, as I always am when I read a book and then you watch the film. You're like, oh, how badly are they going to get this wrong? I thought it was great. It was like one of the first good comic book movies, really. I think it kind of kick-started everything, the first X-Men one. I loved it. But when the second one came out, there was a little story about it. So I had the DVD because of course I bought the DVD. But when X2 came out, there was like the special edition DVD where you got the commentary or something like that. And even though I already
X-Men
had
1.5.
Yeah, that's it, right? So even though I already had it on DVD, just like being a full completist, I bought the second one, and there was a competition. And if you entered the competition, you could, by buying the DVD, you could win a chance to go to a preview screening. So I was lucky enough to win, and I got to go and see the film like a week or two before it actually came out. So I watched it in a room full of media, and they were mostly journalists, writing down their reviews and stuff. And me and my ex at the time was really excited that we got to see it before everyone else, and I didn't have anything spoiled, and it was fantastic. And I was just like, that was the best movie I've ever seen in my life at the time. And I think it was just fantastic, and it also kickstarted for me making sure that I watch superhero films now on opening night.
Mhm.
because I hate the risk of like opening up Twitter or opening up social media or even just like, I don't know, looking on a news website and just seeing a comment that spoils it for everything. Whereas
Yeah.
going to that previous screenings made me be like, no, we have to go for opening night now. We have to have that true experience.
Yeah, I
Which
had
now,
oh sorry, go ahead, Pat.
which I was just gonna say nowadays is no longer Friday, but Thursday, and sometimes
Mhm.
Wednesday night before it comes out. At
It
least
keeps
here in the
creeping in
United
earlier
States.
to the week, yeah.
I know, right? Like it'll just start on Monday now. So
Yeah.
Well, I was super lucky living in Australia because
Mhm.
the world's day starts there. So if you're in Australia, you
Mm,
really are the first people to see it. So
yeah.
we, we're lucky that we don't have to worry there about Americans posting about it on Twitter and ruining it for us.
Mhm.
Nice thing is here if something comes out like spring break time, or if it comes out like in or if they try to shoot for Memorial Day weekend, because we don't have like in Japan, for example, next week is Guardians is coming out on the 5th, but it comes out here on
Mhm.
the 3rd because that's when the holiday week next week starts. So I'm
Ah,
going to get to see it
okay.
2 days before everybody else. So I'm looking
Cool.
forward to that. But yeah, I think my opinion on the first X-Men movie, I think it was somewhere between you two. I really liked it when I first saw it, and I think it was Oscar very similar to what you said. It's just that idea of, oh my god, they got it, they got it. It doesn't suck, it doesn't suck. And then and on repeat viewings, I'm like, well, they kind of change a lot of stuff. I'm like, this maybe doesn't quite
Okay,
work
but
so well. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah,
I guess I'll walk it back a little bit. Like I didn't mean to imply that he didn't like the first movie. I did enjoy it a lot. I think they got more right than they got
yeah,
wrong, but there were still some glaring flaws that even in my heart of my X-Men addict loving heart, I like I couldn't forgive. But not to say like I think they did a great job because there was a lot of expectation and it's a lot of it's a very difficult thing to pull off. And so
yeah.
I think an assessment of it didn't suck like relatively means like they did a good job.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm not,
Yeah.
not trying to impugn the movie. It was
Mhm.
it was good. I enjoyed it, and I still enjoyed it. We covered it way back on an early
Yeah.
episode of this show, and um, but yeah, the more I watch it, it's like the third act is really weak, and Rogue is not Rogue at all. She's basically Kitty Pryde,
Mm,
and there are a lot of issues like that I had with it. Plus, it's just it's basically Wolverine and the X-Men, and
mm,
when the second one came out, like I remember sitting there in the theater and being like, "Oh my god, they got almost everything right." And like it, and one of the things I watching it the other night, I realized I'm like, it is much more of an ensemble piece. Like all the other
mhm,
characters get a lot more attention,
mhm,
except for Cyclops, which we'll talk about. But
mm, mm,
but for the most part, it's not as Wolverine focused as the first one or the third one was, or it's not
mhm,
as like Xavier and Magneto focused or
mhm.
Mystique as the first class stuff was. So I felt like out of all the X-Men movies, this is the one that really felt like it was an ensemble picture. A
Yeah,
lot more than any of the other ones did.
and I think that also hints at, and one of the reasons I really love the second film is it hints at this possibility of like they're going to explore more. They're going to
Mm-hmm.
go into like different facets of the franchise. Like it's not just going to be about Wolverine. It's not just going to be about the Charles Magneto thing because it's such a rich source of material that the second film I think really hints at. Oh, they're going to explore that, or maybe they're going to go here. Like I think it hinted at a lot of different possibilities that they could go to, which unfortunately didn't happen in the third film. But that is not the topic of this episode.
Yeah, I mean
Yeah.
that last scene of this film. I mean, it's just
Yes.
I
Hmm.
remember freaking the fuck out in the theater because I'm like, okay, they're gonna show her. We saw a little bit of the fire effect. I'm like, oh, they got a Phoenix effect. I'm like, that's probably all we're gonna see of it. When
It's
I
just
was
a
thinking in
hint.
this,
It's a tease. Just yeah,
and
they're
then
not
at
going to
the
do it.
end,
They're not
she
doing it.
dies.
No.
I'm like, oh my god,
Hmm.
they killed her. I'm like, oh crap, are they gonna like? They're probably not gonna show anything though. And then at the end, there
Oh.
it shows the
Oh.
vague outline,
Hmm.
and I remember,
Hmm.
and then it just cuts the credits. I'm like, oh fuck, I'm waiting here, waiting until I'm like, there's gonna
Is
be
she going to
something. There's
pop
gonna
out
be
of the
something.
water? Is
Yeah,
she going to do it? Is she going to do it? And I think I in my head canon because I was just when I rewatched it the other day, I had this and I hate nitpicking, but I did it in that one moment. But I'm like, why did she leave the plane? Because I
yeah,
feel like you can just do it from. By the way, inside the plane. And so my headcanon now is like, maybe she knew, like she was gonna go bad. And so like this was her way of like, okay, I'm gonna save everyone and also take care of that little problem.
No, the problem with
Then
that I think was because her powers were interfering with the ship's
with
controls.
the
Because you
ship,
saw that, yeah, because you saw that like
was
all the
there?
lights and stuff were flickering. Yeah, they also hint at that early on when they're in the museum,
Hmm.
and when she's near the TV screens, all of them are flickering on and off.
She had some struggle. She had some struggle with it as well when when Storm did the tornadoes, right? And she was in
Yeah,
the
yeah.
plane.
Yeah, yeah.
She couldn't
Mhm.
just push through it. They put some sort of limitations on her power there.
But I think me and all my X-Men loving friends, when it came out, like that final scene, we were just like, oh, they mean business. Like
Hmm.
this is cool. Like this
Yeah.
team knows what they're talking about, and they're talking to their audience. Although, and also, it's sort of that insider knowledge thing. I think, like, if you didn't read the X Men, I'm sure you're just, what is the big deal, you guys, with this? Why are you going crazy with
Yeah.
this? Whatever that is, are you okay? Like, Pat, are you all right? I'm like, you don't understand, okay? Like,
I
you
do
do
remember
not
like me and
understand the
I
meaning of
saw with a
this.
yeah, I saw with a buddy who was also a big comics fan, and
Hmm.
when that at the end, we were like freaking out. We're standing up, we're clapping, and
Yeah,
everyone's looking at us like,
oh
"What the hell's wrong
yeah,
with
yeah.
you?"
Are you okay?
Yeah.
What's the big deal? It's just water, okay? Are you all right? It's fine.
But yeah,
Which is which was an excuse for me to then explain to friends, which I always find. Well, let me tell you all about this 2 year storyline that happened. So
so yeah. Now, what do you guys think rewatching it for this show?
it held up. It holds up well, I think. I like you said, it's an ensemble piece, which is very enjoyable. Um, it doesn't feel that dated, um, and it's also it feels like um, it's still fresh, like not boring. It didn't feel like a chore to watch it.
Oscar, how
Yeah,
about you?
I feel a very similar kind of way. You know, like I didn't feel like it was a chore to watch it. I do think it is a little long. I
Mm.
It could be trimmed a little bit if I have to give some criticisms. I don't want to say it's like perfect. It's not perfect film. It could be shortened a little bit. I know towards the end, whether at the dam and stuff, I was like, oh, this is. I did feel it was a little bit long, but I think a lot of the political themes that are seeped within it are still super relevant.
Even more
Hmm.
so,
I
I'd
rem-
say.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, perhaps like I remember that the one line, what the president says, like, oh, we can't have any pictures of dead mutant children on the front page of the
6 o'clock news. No
On the
the
dead
6 o'clock
mutants. Yeah,
news.
6 o'clock
That's what he
news.
says.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
and this film came out just as the Iraq War was all
Yeah.
hitting up, right?
Hmm.
And that was
Yeah, I think it came out
that
that
was
summer, if I'm remembering correctly. That the right
Yeah,
after
so it
the
was
Iraq
like a
War.
huge sort. That was definitely like that line in particular was very pointed towards that sort of political situation. And I think it's still relevant now, super relevant now. The coming out scene with
Which
Bobby,
is
that was
so prophetic. So I don't know what the right
look,
word is. I'm
look.
like, yep.
When I
Hmm.
watched it, I was like, oh my god, they get it, because the X Men
Hmm.
is political. It's very political, and
Mhm.
especially for LGBT people. And I was like, oh, thank God, like they get it. But upon rewatching it a second time, I thought, okay, there's no subtlety at all. Right? Just like with that scene, they just like
Hmm.
bang it on the head to make sure that everyone that's eating their popcorn like actually got the message there. Um, but it still needs to be said. I think that's why the the themes of the X Men are kind of timeless.
Well, yeah, I
In
mean, I
terms
think
of the
Yeah.
film,
that's.
it's
Sorry, go ahead.
yeah. I was just going to say, in terms of the film itself, I think the only thing I would really say upon the second viewing now, like what is it, like 20 years later,
Yeah.
is
20
that
years.
it's a little bit long. It's a little bit long.
I would also say that and this isn't necessarily, well, it is a criticism, but it may be a thing that's necessary given it's one film and you have so many characters that you're playing with. Like, not all of them get the same kind of plot servicing that I would have
Hmm.
wanted. but again, you're working with a limited time. And Oscar already said it's already too long, so we can't add any more minutes and screen time to some characters. But it would have been nice to give the same kind of treatment that some of the characters got to others, like poor Lady Deathstrike, for example, who,
Yeah.
I mean, she got that awesome fight scene, but I mean, she would have, it would have been nice to get her more character development. Pyro 2, I don't know why I thought this. And, oh, I know why, because I just found out recently and I didn't know this about the comic book character. Like, apparently, he writes romance novels, like in the comics.
Mhm.
Like, he was a romance
And he's
novelist.
also Australian.
Right, right. I'm like, wouldn't that have been interesting? Like, what if this Pyro was also some kind of budding romance novelist? But no, he's just sort of like the jackass, like foil to Bobby, because fire and ice. So, okay, fine.
I actually liked Pyro's, that they had someone sort of go to the dark side and
Mhm.
get, tempted by the power. That's a super important part of the X-Men as well. I'm glad that they put someone in there that did that. But I think Pyro's character was just, it could have been anyone, right? It was just,
Yeah, yeah.
it was just like, oh, we'll use the fire because it's the perfect sort of match to go with Iceman.
Hmm.
They
Also,
I mean,
they
like,
had him in. They had that cameo of him in the first movie, so I think that was also why they're
right.
like, "Oh, we can use him now
Yeah.
for that." And I thought it was yeah, I really liked Pyro in this. I thought he was Aaron Stanford came in. He replaced the guy who did the cameo in the first movie.
Hmm.
And I thought he was a lot of fun. Like just like trying to be a dick. Like I love to see with talking about the coming out scene
Hmm.
when the mother's like, "Oh, this is all my fault," and he's like, "No, actually, they found out that men are the one who pass on the mutant
It's
gene, so
his
it's his
fault.
fault."
That's his
Yeah.
fault.
My headcanon is like that's not actually true. Pyro just fucking with them.
Mm. Mm.
I also read an interview with him, but I don't know why I remember this, but he said that the flicking of the lighter, the on and off flicking of the lid of the lighter, was not in the script, and that was something that he just sort of ad-libbed to
Mm.
act like a dick, to annoy everyone.
Mm.
And it worked.
And,
It works.
Yeah,
yeah, for
good job.
sure, fantastic.
Mhm.
That's if it should have been in the script. That's one thing I will add about looking back on this movie 20 years later is that the writing of the film is superb.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
it's clearly much better than a lot of the other. I just watched Ant-Man a few weeks ago, and I was like,
Um,
oh,
mm.
I hated it. And it's not very many movies that I actually hate. I
Mm.
hated
Do,
Ant-Man,
do
and
you mean the
watching
new
X-Men
one,
2, I
Oscar?
was like, this is so much better.
You're talking about
Um,
Quantumania, you mean?
the new
Yes,
Ant-Man movie? Okay.
yeah.
I
I
also
know
like the
that Perry enjoyed
I
it,
dug
but
it. Yeah, I dug the. I mean, it wasn't as good as the other two Ant-Man movie, but and it's definitely not as good as X2. I'll agree with you on that. But I like that they swung, and there were definitely a lot of problems with it, but I like that they swung for the fences with the super sciency Kirby weirdness type of stuff. Um,
I was gonna say I also liked how I know it's a lot, it is a long movie, but there's a sense of economy to, there were so many cameos, and I think they did
mhm.
it in such a way where, and I like it when it hits that magic spot of like, okay, if you know, you know, and it's gonna push your buttons. But if you don't know, it's not really intrusive to the flow of the film.
yeah,
So there's all those cool cameos with like Colossus, you know, and he does a thing. Siren is sort of like the early alarm system for the school, I guess, which works. But if you know, you know, right? Like, that's a cool nugget given to the
We get Beast
fans.
on the TV, and
Right, and then
yeah.
Kate, of course.
mhm.
She's Kate now, walking through the walls. So all those like little cool tidbits
You know
I
what's
really
funny
like
I
that
about
was glad it made it to the screen.
all of those cameos we recognize as the characters, and I think later on in the films, especially in The Last Stand and stuff, all of
Hmm.
the extras, we'll say, were
Yeah.
not as identifiable and perhaps not even characters. They've just made it up rather than
Hmm.
taking them
right?
from the books. I really like that all of those little background characters in X-Men 2 were proper Easter eggs for the fans.
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
Oh, and
like
not
you
to
said, it
mention,
did feel a lot more natural. Like you compare it to like in X-Men Origins Wolverine, where it felt completely forced in. They're like, let's just try and grab in as many mutants as we can and throw them in there, even if it doesn't make any sense. Whereas here, all the cameos, it felt like a natural thing to have those specific characters in those spots.
The writing, that's what it is.
The writing was good. Yeah. I want to mention one of the things about Kate that I thought was funny was that rewatching these movies is that they use a different actor in the first three
every
movies.
film, right? Yes,
and it seems like she gets younger with each movie.
It's her secondary mutation. Okay, like she gets younger as she goes on.
The same thing happened with Jubilee.
Yeah.
No, it's the same actress as Jubilee in these two movies.
Really?
Yeah, it was Kia Wong in both of these two. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
I was gonna say too, that scene with Mystique when she breaks into the office, like what a clever way to Easter egg it, right? Because when she's looking at the computer and there's all those references, and you're like, Franklin Richards, Project Wide Awake, like, oh my god, they're Sentinels, y'all. Oh my god, like I know what that is. I'm so much better than all the other theater audience members right now. But that was just such a cool part and so economical.
Mystique's scene there is that scene, the two scenes that she has, right, in this film, are better than any of the Mystique focused scenes in any of the other movies that were, basically Mystique films.
110% agree.
Yes.
It's so good. Like even when she has very few lines as well, but they really got her character by the sneaking into the government facility. Yes, that is totally Mystique. And why do you could walk around and look like anyone. Why do you choose to walk around looking like this? And she says, because why, we shouldn't have to. Shouldn't have to hide.
It's funny because I remember when Rebecca Romaine was first cast in the first movie, everyone's just kind of like, oh, they're just casting her because she's a supermodel and because she's in the news right now, and so they just want someone who looks good. And then you watch her in this movie, and like, no, she's actually a pretty decent actress. And like in just those few little moments, she completely captures who Mystique is. Far better than Jennifer Lawrence did in 3 fucking movies?
Yeah, where she's the centerpiece of the whole films. Well, maybe not the last one, but whatever.
Yes. And I mean, say what you will about models or whatever, but I have a lot of respect for anybody who's going to sit in a makeup chair for God knows how long, like having that applied on you day in and day out. Like,
was it something like 6 or 7 hours?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, it was a long
I remember
time.
she said when they were filming the first movie, they actually had to, because between takes, because they were filming outside, they actually had to cover her up and like warm her up with hair dryers off. So like she's standing there like literally naked and in the freezing cold. Like that's fucking commitment. Jennifer Lawrence couldn't even bother to do it because she made up a skin allergy all of a sudden after she had worn it in the first movie.
Oh, and they shot in Vancouver, right? Or
just really cold.
And it's not it's not warm in Vancouver, y'all. So yeah.
But speaking of that scene when she's speaking to Nightcrawler, how awesome is Nightcrawler in this movie? I mean, like that opening scene. Oh my god! Every time I watch that scene, that is one of the greatest set pieces in any superhero movie, bar none. That is such an amazing use of Nightcrawler and his powers. Tells you everything you need to know about who he is and what he can do.
I don't know about who he is. I don't know whether it tells you about who he is, but it certainly tells you about what he can do. And I don't know. I totally agree. It's one of the best openings of any superhero film. Like that, it's perfection. But when I started reading, maybe it's a personal view as well, when I was reading the X-Men and watching the cartoon series and stuff, Nightcrawler was always in Excalibur. So he was never part of what I associated with the X-Men. And when they sort of came back and joined the team, I've always seen him as not like just off in the side. Then I watched this opening scene. It fully changed my perspective of Nightcrawler. Now I'm like, wow, this dude is like strong. Like what a cool power. This is actually like a very aggressive and strong power. I can't even think of another word, like strong power. But in terms of his character, I feel like that's the one character they missed the mark on. I feel like they put the scars on his face and said, oh, it's a link to his religion, and it was a visual way to show that he's a religious person. But I just kind of thought, I don't really think that he wasn't fun. He wasn't what else? What other word? If you're just going to describe Nightcrawler in 3 words from the comics, what would you say?
Charming.
He's jovial, like he's
Charming, jovial, fun.
yeah, outgoing.
What 3 words would you say to describe Nightcrawler from X2?
I will use 2 words, and those words are plot device.
Okay.
I
Fair enough.
agree with you on the. I think they did overdo the religious stuff. I mean, I know he's super Catholic in the comics too and everything, but like scarring himself with like the symbols from that was taking the religious aspect a little bit too much. I kind of felt the same way when they did him in the animated series when they had him in that episode. I'm like, you're focusing way too much on the Catholic side of thing without forgetting about this whole other aspect to him. Although he did have moments in this movie. Like, I love that when he's trying to introduce himself and everything like that. And I thought, though, we got little hints of what Alan Cumming could have done if they had done a better job writing the character.
And I do think with these films, because I feel in some ways we're very spoiled a little bit, because at least with Marvel, you always go into these films, or maybe the creators do too, with the assumption or framework that like, oh, we're going to have more than one film to develop and give these characters these moments and like, things in which they can develop. But back then it's like, well, maybe you just have this one film and you have to pack in as much as you can. So there's this element of like, unfortunately, you may have to pick and choose what aspect of the characters to emphasize, and those things may have to be what serves the plot. I mean, if you want to talk about underserved characters, like poor Storm, like who is even Storm? What is she, other than again awesome set pieces and her disappearing accent, which is a thing. But other than that, I'm like, who is this? This doesn't feel like Storm.
No. I mean, I was thinking about that scene that she has with Nightcrawler when he says, someone so beautiful should not be so angry. I'm like, that is not Storm at all.
She's not like angry. No, I mean she can like kick your butt, but I wouldn't describe her as like angry.
Yeah. I thought going with angry black woman stereotype was such a disservice to that character.
Definitely, Halle Berry has said many times that she wished that the character in the films was more like the characters in the books, more of a leader, and I think she tried to have some moments in the later films. But all of the films with Storm, they've missed the mark, and I wonder whether that's because it's really hard to translate that character's strength to film.
Well, here's my thought. Okay, and this happened too when it came out in 2003. Like, the bulk of the film is set in this cavernous environment when they get to the alkali base, and I'm like, she's claustrophobic. Give the woman a moment where that happens and she can like work through that. Like, what a cool moment that would have been, right? Because it doesn't come up as often now, but I'm like, that was a key part of her character. It still is.
You'd have to explain where that came from, rather. Well, maybe you wouldn't. She could just be like, I'm not going down that tunnel. I'm not going down that tunnel.
Or like,
I mean, just have like you could have little, there are little ways to hint at it, especially because the assumption is you're
in a tunnel. You're in you're in a contained space. Like that would have like triggered. That would have triggered that. I think. Like,
but talking about
interesting how.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to mention it. I was just going to mention when Pat mentioned about the ensemble and about how everyone did get a moment. And like, even though we say Nightcrawler's moment was not, really in tune with his character, or was the best use of his character, might be a better way to phrase it. I think like you could. I mean, when I watched X2 the first time, I went with my partner at the time, who had never watched the cartoon or read the book, knew nothing about it. But when we walked out of the cinema, he was like, he could name the characters and he knew who they were. I took my brother to see The New Mutants, and when we walked out of the film, we went and had dinner, and he said, what was that character's name? And I said, which one? And then he thought about it, and he was like, you know what? I don't even know any of their names. And I was like, wow, I can understand how you don't know any of their names. That's really bad. So I just want to give like a shout out again to how good the writing is, because I think everybody in the film does get a moment. You kind of know what everyone's power is. You kind of know everyone's name, even though it's quite a huge cast.
Well, and I think then I may be wrong. It's been a while since I saw it, but I don't. So in the New Mutants movie, I don't think they ever like referred to each other as code names. Like it was just all their
It's
proper.
all just their real names. Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah. Whereas
Well,
in
that's
the
even
X,
worse then, because in X-Men you've got two names and people still remember them.
but they make a point of like, because in the first film it was so memorable with Wolverine sort of like jokingly like, oh, Storm, and Cyclops, what
Yeah.
did they call you, Wheels? So like it's sort of
Yeah.
like it's described in the audience's brain like, oh, okay, these people got code names, like that's what they're called. And I do agree, like everyone got set pieces, if not the kind of character development I would like that moment when she was doing all those tornadoes, right? Like I
Mhm.
think when I got the DVD, I would just keep repeating that moment because it was just so cool. Like, let's
I
watch
remember
that again. Let's watch it
we were
again.
talking with me and my buddy when he pointed out after we left the theater. He's like
Mhm.
that female jet pilot. I wonder if there was Carol Danvers. So when the DVD came out, we were like going slow,
Oh,
try and see the
is it?
name.
Is it?
Yeah,
Uh,
it's
who
not,
had the
but
rights back then? Let's figure it out. Yeah.
speaking of characters who get the shaft though in this, like I don't think any character suffered more in this movie or in this franchise as a whole than Cyclops. Like he
Mhm.
just got so shortchanged,
Oh,
and the tragedy of it is there were more scenes filmed with James Marsden, right? And like the fight scene he has, the brief fight scene in the prison
Mhm.
cell, that was a longer extended fight scene because James Marsden went up to them. He's like, hey, I want to have something else with Cyclops, maybe to show that he actually knows how to fight. Because in the first
Mhm.
movie, all I'm going is like this the whole time. So let's
Yeah.
have a scene where he can't use his powers, so he has to fight. And so they had done this whole scene where he grabs one of the batons and he's fighting them off, all badass and stuff. And it's like the whole thing happens off screen.
Mhm.
And we never get to see any of it. And also, like, there's this scene shot about him being brainwashed. There was some more
Mhm.
character stuff with him in that too. Never ended up anywhere as far as I'm aware, like not even on deleted scenes or anything like that. But it was shot, it was filmed. And then you look at the first movie where almost all the extended scenes in the first movie that were cut were with Cyclops, and it was like him talking to Jean, him dealing more with Logan, him talking with the professor, and you watch those scenes and you realize Marsden had a really good handle on Cyclops. Like he plays him cool and collected throughout everything. And even in the third movie, like he's only in it for 5 minutes, but he gives like the best performance in the goddamn movie. And it's like,
Mhm.
poor guy got so shortchanged in these movies.
I would say though that I think Storm is slightly more underserved because at least I could say like this love triangle thing which we see so much of in these films is sort of like a key component of the character. So we at least get some idea of what's going on with his interior life and his life outside being a superhero, which I don't think we got with Storm. And perhaps that shafting says something about, I don't know, like test audiences or maybe the editors. Like, we just don't like this guy, so we're gonna keep cutting his stuff.
I think Storm at least gets the big fight scenes, right? She at least gets
Mm-hmm.
the big set pieces that
Mm-hmm.
sort of move those action scenes along, whereas Cyclops kind of misses out on both ends there. I think well, the films can only go for 2 hours, even though this one
Yeah.
felt a little long. They still can only go for 2 hours. You can only fit so much in, and
Mhm.
and I think, like you mentioned
Mm-hmm.
earlier, Pat, the resource material is so rich.
Mm-hmm.
I think I don't want to say it's lazy writing. It's not lazy, but it's a bit of a shortcut. In order to make Wolverine cool, you make
Mhm.
Cyclops a
Not
nerd
as
or
cool.
boring.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I think that if they're both cool, because Cyclops is cool, he's
Yeah.
certainly become much cooler now. I think in the last
Mm-hmm.
10 years, and the character is he's definitely become one of my favorites. Um, it's much cooler now than he was back then, and I think it makes a better love triangle if both of the potential suitors are
Mm-hmm.
worthy,
Yeah.
instead of having one that's like blah, and then the other one's like such a cool dude who's not
Yeah,
There's
going to
I
no
choose the
agree.
need.
cool dude.
There's no need to
But
disparage Wolverine, Oscar. So he's not
I'm not
bad. All
disparaging
right.
him. He is a
I know.
cool
I'm
dude.
making a
I
statement there. I was trying to make a
hope in the
statement. So.
recast of
Mm-hmm.
when the mutants come to the MCU, that
Mm-hmm.
they make Wolverine 5'5". I hope they make him ugly, and I hope they make him mean and angry.
So
I
Danny
don't
And
want
DeVito is Wolverine.
Hey,
I
look,
would sign up for
I'm
that
only
maybe.
5'7", and I love that he was short. But I just think like it'd be much cooler if they make it. Well, Hugh Jackman, how are you going to replace Hugh Jackman? They have to go in the opposite direction, and by making it a bit more true to the comics, I think that would be a little bit cool. I think it'd be very cool.
And I hope that it doesn't become the Wolverine hour. Like I know he has to be there
Yeah.
because he sells the tickets, but there's so much more to mine.
Well, I think one of the benefits of having the MCU and having Disney money is they don't like, because back then it was like, okay, we can do an X-Men movie or we can do a Wolverine movie. We can't do both.
Both, right?
Was kind of the thinking for a long time. I mean, now there's no reason you can't have a string of Wolverine solo movies and just have him pop into the X-Men movies on occasion too. So I think we could definitely get a lot more mileage out of these other characters and just have Wolverine as a less of a presence in the big movies and instead focus more on his solo adventures, which I think would be great. I mean, I'd love to see. Yeah. I personally, I think in a lot of ways, Wolverine works best when he's solo. I think I think a lot of his solo adventures are a lot more interesting than when he's with the X-Men. So I like, put him in Madripoor, have him run around, do that kind of stuff. That'd be a lot of fun to watch. But also with the Cyclops thing, and if you look at that first movie, and if you watch those deleted scenes, you don't notice it the first time you watch it, but when you watch on repeat viewings, you really realize that Morrison is playing Cyclops very cool. Like that scene when Wolverine goes up to him and he's like, Cyclops, right? He grabs him. He's like, you want to get out of my way? And Scott just kind of looks at him and he looks over at the professor and like this silent word. He's kind of saying like, listen, you going to tell your guy to back up before I bust his ass? That's kind of like what I'm feeling. And also when Wolverine's like, there's this extended scene when he's talking to Wolverine in the room and Wolverine comes up and is like, you ever seen real combat, boy? And Scott just like, he's like, this motherfucker right here. He's just like, he's like, have you? He's like, you don't remember anything about your past. Do you? What the fuck have you seen? And he's just like all calm and cool. And everything Wolverine is saying to him is just like bouncing right off him. And he's just completely unaffected by it at all.
And then you kind of see that too in the first movie again when they were talking about Jean, and I think he responded with like, well, if I did that, she wouldn't be my girl.
Exactly.
I mean, right.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
If I had to say stay away from her, she wouldn't be my girl.
Yeah, exactly.
And then he throws it out the end anyway. He's like, in Logan, stay away from my girl. But he just kind of like tosses it out like a smug way.
Also, by the way, one thing I will say though about this film is, I don't know if you guys feel the same way, but like, it's so monotone. Which I think is, I mean, we were just talking about Quantumania a little bit ago, but like, it's so monotone, and like superhero films now, I feel there's so much more of a color palette. But like with this film, it's like, it's dark or it's darker. Which I think it's an interesting contrast.
A big part of that was just, I think, I excuse a lot of that because of just the time period it was in. Because, I mean, back then, the image everybody still had of superheroes was like, Batman and Robin or Batman 66. So it's like superheroes are lame. And so there's whole idea of like, well, we can't do the full superhero thing. Like, and I always say like X-Men walked so Spider-Man could run. Because in Spider-Man we got like the colorful costumes.
For sure.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yes.
But also still I think even in 2003, like it was kind of a thing where it's like, okay, we can excuse Spider-Man, we can excuse Superman, but everything else has to be more grounded and gritty and realistic. And that was kind of the idea. And I think it's not until you get to Avengers when you really have this explosion of like, yeah, we're going to have colorful costumes now.
But I mean,
the Matrix was also like a really big thing at that time as well, right? That was in the zeitgeist of having the black leather was very, very cool. And I think it might have been a pushback from, or a push away from Batman and Robin when they tried to do color in that, and everyone was like,
no, absolutely. Also, when you think about, the X-Men too, if you're going to have a group of superheroes that it would make sense for them to be all in matching leather outfits, it makes sense for the X-Men more than like the Justice League or the Avengers or something like that.
Yeah.
Oscar looks like he's contemplating that idea.
Yeah, I am. I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking, is it? I don't know. I'm going to have to let that percolate in my brain for a little bit.
Well, I
I
think
think it makes
because
a little bit more sense for the X-Men, just because they're
yeah,
always a team. They have a history of matching outfits and all that anyway. And that whole idea of them being this kind of like search and rescue operation that Morrison played with, which talked about it fits that kind of idea. Whereas, and you can have that play out where they're not really superheroes; they're just kind of out to protect themselves, type of thing, or to. Whereas then you get to the Avengers or the Justice League, they're superheroes, right? You can't run away
mhm.
from it there as much.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. No, I think you've explained that really clearly. I
I mean, I
agree.
would prefer to
I think
have some sort of color in the costumes. I definitely agree with that. But if you're going to choose one property that has to be in black leather, I think it makes sense for it to be the X-Men.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree completely. I think the black leather is really really cool, and cinematically it definitely looks better. Um, I don't know about in the books. I think I actually like the color. I
Hmm.
like a bit more of tone. It doesn't have to be like super bright.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the Avengers look really really good bright. I can never imagine like the Avengers or Justice League or something like that being in all black leather.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I agree. It just doesn't work. Like you can't imagine like Captain America running around in an all black leather suit. It wouldn't make any sense. He just wouldn't really be Captain America then, or
Hmm.
Superman for
Captain
that matter.
America, Agent of Shield or something.
Um, I want to talk about Brian Cox too as Stryker. So they made that big change from the comic books, whereas is a lot of this is based on God Loves Man Kills, but instead of
Hmm.
Stryker being a preacher, here he's a military scientist. What do you guys think about those changes and what they did, and what how Brian Cox portrayed Stryker in this?
I think he did a great job. Like, and I feel like at least in the movies I've seen of him, he plays that kind of smarmy, really off-putting character very well. Um, and I think the changes make sense because I think it allows you to get what they needed from the character in the source material, but also allowing it to connect to the Wolverine plotline in an important way. Um, and I don't know if like there were concern, and I'm just making this next stuff up in my head. Like I don't know if there's a concern about we didn't want to piss off the religious people, so
Yeah,
we're
Mm-hmm.
gonna make him a military officer. Um,
I think that you wouldn't want to upset the Middle America by
mhm.
demonizing religious figures too much. Um, I admit I hadn't read God Love Van Kills before X2, so I didn't think much. I didn't know much about the comparison. The only thing I knew about God Loves Van Kills is that scene with Kitty Pryde
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
speaking out, the famous one there. Um, and that wasn't in the film, so I found that an interesting omission. Um, I think Brian Cox was great. I think Stryker was a good villain. The only he had a good motive. A motive is probably the most important thing that a villain can have to make it
Mhm.
make sense. But having his son and him dealing with all of that, that was good. The only thing that I found a little bit weird was like I was like, okay, so the villain is using mutants as weapons, and it's a
Mm-hmm.
military man, but he wants to kill all the mutants.
Mhm.
Wouldn't you want to keep them all as weapons?
Yeah,
But I
that's a
felt
good point.
like
I
it
never considered
was,
that, but that's a good point.
but my
To me,
reading
that
of
was
it
a bit of
is
a
like
plot hole.
I think that was the means to his end, right? Which is killing all
Mm-hmm.
of them. I mean, so like if they're all gone, I suppose there's no longer a need to have these kinds of weapons to deal with this problem because they're all gone. Like you wouldn't need Deathstrike anymore because there's no more Wolverine to deal with. I suppose is how I made it work.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
but then there's going to be new ones born. It's
Mm.
it's the same kind of thing with
Oh,
the
but
nuclear
you're right.
weapons,
You're
right?
correct. Yeah,
You're not never going to get rid of the mutants, so it just that kind of
which
I was like, doesn't make
which I
sense.
suppose maybe speaks to just his mental state of like this doesn't this what you're doing already doesn't make sense on an ethical level, but just from a purely like trying to get it where you want to be, it also doesn't make sense because it's not you're going to get rid of mutants now, but there may be more coming in the future.
That's a good point. I hadn't even thought about that part.
Yeah.
That you're killing all the mutants that exist, but that's not going to stop new ones from being born. That's a good
Right.
point. Yeah, I think the supervillain plot in both this movie and the first movie are kind of weak in both of them, right? It's like Magneto is using this machine to turn everybody into mutants, and it's like then they'll be just like us, and they'll follow, and our cause will be like. I think it's, and then this one too, we're going to use Cerebro to kill all the mutants. It felt like they didn't quite know how to execute like some big supervillain plot. And I think like both of them, the supervillain plot, when you think about it, it doesn't quite hold together. So yeah, I agree with you on that.
Strikers at least is more convincing to me than
It
Magneto's
is, yeah.
in the first film, because I don't think Magneto would ever do that. I mean, because
Well, also, yeah, the thing about Magneto in the first film that annoyed me is the fact that he's using Rogue to power the machine because he doesn't want to be he doesn't want to sacrifice himself. I'm like, that's Magneto would be willing to do that in the comics, I think. And so I like the original version. If you guys ever read the original screenplay, it was that the adamantium actually powered the machine, so he needed Wolverine in the machine, and and then Rogue ended up saving the day in the original script. But they changed that because they're like, well, we can't have Wolverine be the damsel in distress. We have to have him save the day.
Yeah. Oh no, yes.
That's interesting that they minimize Rogue in order to pump Wolverine up. It's funny you said you didn't like Rogue in the films. I actually really liked that they depowered her a bit and took her back to her original kind of state by just absorbing the powers and not always being like Carol Danvers kind of level mutant. I liked that.
I didn't mind the depowering, but it's just like the character, just like the way they handled her character. She just doesn't feel like Rogue to me. Like I said, she feels more like young Kitty Pryde when she was all shy and scared of everything.
Yeah.
We don't get any of that like fiery personality that Rogue has. So that's what, bones me out on rewatches of these movies.
Well, like I think they're contractually obligated. Every X thing has to have the young ingenue character. Like you can't be without such that kind of.
They did a similar thing in the animated series too. Like Jubilee in the animated series, she's much more Kitty Pryde-esque than she is like Jubilee in the comics. So they seem to always gravitate towards this Kitty Pryde type character, even if it's not Kitty Pryde in these other adaptations, which is kind of disappointing.
Is Kitty Pryde like the is she more like the template that everyone else is going off rather than?
Well, at least in adaptations, because like Perry said, Jubilee and Rogue aren't like that in the source material. But it seems like when you're adapting stuff, someone always has to play that role in the story.
And I think,
there was just to be like the audience perspective as well, right? For the new reader, the new watcher.
Yep.
But Oscar, you also made the point that how Nightcrawler wasn't really part of the main X-Men books when you started reading in the 90s. And yeah, that was true for me as well, because he didn't come in until it was like the late 90s, like when Excalibur ended and they came back.
I think it wasn't until like 99 or something like that.
Something like that. Yeah, and if you look at the classic X-Men team, right? It's like it's the classic core of the X-Men team. It's like Wolverine, Storm, Nightcrawler, Colossus, Shadowcat. That's like when you think about like the classic era of the X-Men comics, that was like the core team, those five. And in these movies, you get Wolverine and Storm, but then Kitty Pryde is just a cameo. Nightcrawler has a decent role in this movie. Colossus just appears in that one scene, and then ironically enough, he has more lines in his cameo appearance than he has when he's supposed to be a member of the actual team in the other movies. And then you bring in the other, because I think they're basing this more on, like Bryan Singer said that when he was doing research of it, a lot of his research was the animated series. So he's basing it more on like the 90s stuff than he is basing it on the classic comics.
That's interesting that he said that, and then he went with God Loves, Man Kills.
I think it's just because that story really kind of captures the themes he wanted to, of like one of the things he was looking at the legacy virus too, as one of the early ideas. So I think he was planning to do more 90s related stuff, but I don't know, someone somewhere decided let's do God Loves Man Kills instead. And I think it really works. I think also that time period, the early 2000s, the evangelical right was such a political powerhouse in America that
Mhm.
if you did anything to cross them, like you were basically dead in the water. So I think back then too, it would have been a real gamble to do that. But I think now I would really like to see an adaptation of God Loves Man Kills that hews a lot closer to the comics. Funny thing too, Bruce Davison, who plays Senator Kelly, I just read this article about it the other day because I was wondering, I wonder what political party he is in the comic books, if they ever mention it or not. And I was looking it up, and one of the things that came up was that in the early 2000s, during like the Iraq War period, Bruce Davison was lobbying Congress on behalf of like the arts and all that, and Republican politicians were always so excited to meet him because they loved Senator Kelly in the first movie.
Some
so
people
funny.
did not get the point of the. I don't know. Did you guys? There was. I'm not sure what state that politician was from, and he was ranting about, of course,
Oh, that was
trans
Florida.
rights.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, and he's like, these people are like mutants in the X-Men movie, and I think that the whole gist of his rant was like, there's these weird mutant freaks, and we need to control them and get rid of them. Like, you did not get the point of that film, sir. Or
You're
maybe you did.
literally
Okay, I
becoming
don't know.
the
Yeah.
evil character from the
Right,
books.
right,
Did you guys ever
right.
watch How I Met Your Mother?
I have not.
Very, very occasionally.
So I'm not sure if Oscar, and I'm sure if you ever go, but you know, Neil Patrick Harris's character, Barney, he has this bit where he always identifies with the villains in movies. So like, you know, he says the Karate Kid is the story of Johnny Lawrence and who learns humility after suffering a defeat by a kid who cheats at the gate by doing an illegal kick. And he says like, you know, Hans Gruber is the main character of Die Hard, right? He dies hard at the end. He's the central character.
Which I at least for the Karate Kid thing, he may have a point after all the Cobra Kai stuff. But
well, I think that actually
maybe...
influenced Cobra Kai
Oh,
because
really?
Johnny.
Oh, well,
yeah,
there you go.
because William Zabka actually
you go.
played himself on How I Met Your Mother in like the later seasons.
Okay. Oh, I did not know that, and that's kind of cool.
So
but yeah,
funny.
I think it's funny because it's also like, you know, Ted Cruz was asked one time who his favorite hero was, and he's like, oh, Rorschach, and it's like, I think you missed the point of that character.
It's like, oh no, or I feel like, but you could say, I think, okay, I like that. Like, I think you can both admit that he's problematic and like him, but it can't be that sort of like unadulterated, like, I like him and I admire him. And
I think it was I like him and I admire him.
Okay, and I want to be more like him. Like it,
Yeah.
But at that point, I think you missed the point of the text, sir. So
it's like
I think
people who
Ted
say
Cruz
that
misses the point of everything, though, right?
Yeah. Well, it's like that. Sting had said that he'd had couples come up to him and say that, you know, Every Breath You Take is such a great song. We played at our wedding, and he's just thinking, he's like, get the fuck away from me.
He was like, no.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to say Roxanne, but that works too.
Yeah.
I was like, Roxanne? Okay.
How about
I think
Wolverine in
when
this
I
movie? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I
Oscar.
love Wolf. I was just going to say, I was thinking one thing I did want to mention with you guys when I rewatched the film is that there are so many standout scenes throughout this film.
Mm-hmm.
The opening scene is the big one. For me, the Bobby coming out scene was a big one. Then you have the Magneto breaking out of prison.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Like
Yeah.
that is fantastic. Then
let's mention the Lady Deathstrike scene. We haven't given
the
her
fight scene with Lady Deathstrike and Wolverine.
Mm-hmm.
So good. I found it
Mhm.
interesting that in both the films, Wolverine's nemesis was female. Because in the first one, he was fighting Mystique.
Yes.
And then the second one, he's fighting
I was going to say
Lady Deathstrike.
Sabretooth, but you're right. I think the scene with Mystique was more of a set piece than the scene with Sabretooth.
For sure. That was the big climatic one. The
Yeah.
Sabretooth Wolverine fight was just a little bit at the start, right?
Well, in the third
And in this
film,
one, it's...
he fights Jean, technically.
Yeah, so what,
Yeah.
what is up with that?
I don't know.
No, it's a good point. I never considered that, but yeah.
Mhm.
Well, also in X-Men Origins, right? It's Silver Fox is kind of like one of the driving forces behind like a lot of the problems that's happening in that movie too. Yeah, there's a lot of Wolverine fighting women in these movies, isn't there?
Well, no, and Viper, she was the
Viper,
main
true, yeah,
baddie.
in the Wolverine, you're right, yeah.
Mhm, yes, yes.
That's
God, she
super
was such a
interesting
waste
now
in that
you
movie,
add them
though.
all up.
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean,
That movie
there's
had
so
such
many.
such potential to be really, really good, and just lost it a little bit at the end. Like it
Are you
just,
talking about the Wolverine?
yeah.
The Wolverine, I like it. The third act is really where it loses me, but like the up until then, it's great. I love it. Everything up
Yeah.
until the third act is perfect.
I think
It
that
was
the
supposed to
shark.
be directed by Aronofsky as well, and then
Aronofsky was
the
in talks to do it. Yeah.
yeah, he was all on board to do it, but then the Fukushima disaster happened, and he was like, I don't want to film in Japan, and it got moved on to somebody
That
else. Whether
Yeah. I guess that did happen. That timeline does work out because it came out in 2013. So yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think what happened with that movie is when they got to the third act, I feel like that was the studio getting nervous about the fact that there wasn't enough superhero-y type stuff. So like, we're in Japan, let's throw a big robot in.
I know. I think the shark was jump when like, oh, that's the Silver Samurai. Okay, all right, great. Okay.
Hey guys,
what were you saying?
So we were talking about Lady Deathstrike was where we had left off right before I had to pause up. Yeah, that was such a great fight scene, and it's a shame that we don't get any sort of real characters. He's just basically a glorified henchman in this movie. And even still, like she's nothing like the comics, right? No cybernetics or anything like that. She's just basically a female Wolverine.
Yep, with more appendages that are sharp, I suppose. But I think Kelly, she did what she could with the material she was given.
Oh yeah. But I mean, I think
she been in anything else?
Oh yeah, she's been in a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
She was on. She played China White on Arrow in the early seasons as well, and she was in I think the Scorpion King. She was in that and a bunch of other stuff. She does a lot of like sci-fi type movies and fantasy type stuff. Like she's in a lot of stuff like that. But yeah, Hugh Jackman as Wolverine. I really liked a lot of what he did in this movie. I love that interaction when he comes back to the mansion he has with Professor X, where he comes into Cerebro and he's like, if you keep smoking that cigar in Cerebro, you'll live the rest of your days on the belief that you're a 6-year-old girl and I'll have Jean braid your hair.
Which I think also does a great job of sort of introducing the notion that Charles is dangerous. Like, well, we should have known, given his power set, but he's always mostly portrayed as like this very benevolent headmaster. And then he says that line, like, oh, right, that's a thing he can do. That's a thing he can really do.
The scene in the museum gives a bit of an indication with that as well, right? When he suddenly makes everyone freeze. And that's like, wow, he just doesn't even have to move, and suddenly everyone's just frozen still. He can do what he likes. So
then he does it. He also does it too at the end with the White House too. Although the only thing, what I hate about that scene though, is that I don't hate them in these movies, but it's that it became a template that keeps being used in all the other movies. Then, and it just kind of gets old then.
It's kind of a thing as well where he's so powerful that he's going to get hijacked, and then it's going to be the end of everything. So it's kind of like the most dangerous thing that can ever happen is Charles Xavier loses control.
Well, and we see that in Logan. Like, I mean, I think obviously they were paying a lot of attention to this movie when they were writing Logan, because that's what killed the X-Men was Xavier's mind deteriorating and he loses control of his powers.
Do you guys think that? Do you guys think?
Sorry, go ahead, Oscar.
Go ahead, Perry. No, I was just going to say, do you guys? I always thought that X2 was kind of like the best of the X-Men films, and rewatching it, I still feel that same way.
I think I need to rewatch Days of Future Past to decide.
That's up there. First Class, Days of Future Past, Logan, Deadpool, X-Men 2. Those 5 are.
If we're talking, I'm separate in my mind. I separate the Wolverine and the Deadpool movies because I think they're a separate thing. And I think about just like the X-Men movies, just the team movies. This one is still my favorite. Days of Future Past is a very close second, but the problem I have with Days of Future Past is that it it's not enough of a team movie, right? It's still just Wolverine, Magneto, Xavier, Mystique. It's just focused on like those 4 characters. And also, I didn't like that we spend so much more time in the 1970s, because actually, when I watch Days of Future Past, I'm so much more interested in the future stuff and how the world got to that point.
Yeah.
I mean,
but
the road cut has some story problems, but I
was gonna
actually
say,
like it more because of all the extra future scenes we get.
Agreed.
I mean, First Class, I like First Class, but I don't really like the portrayal of Xavier in it. I love Magneto, but it's still just, and like all the other characters are basically just glorified special effects. Like they've got they don't really have any real characterization to them. Plus, it's just kind of like, that was a weird movie where it's like we're kind of a reboot, but we're kind of a prequel. We don't really know what we are, so there's a lot of continuity issues. And the first half of it I love, but when they get to the second half, it starts to fall apart for me. Like, if I would have loved First Class so much more if it was just Magneto Nazi Hunter.
Yeah, I remember reading somewhere, I think it was after that film was done, or maybe it was before. I'm pretty sure it was after. There was talk about doing a Magneto solo film with Fassbender.
That was actually before, because they were after The Last Stand kind of bombed. The whole idea that Fox had was, we're just going to do a bunch of solo movies. So it was going to start off with like the X-Men Origins Wolverine. X-Men Origins was supposed to be like a brand. And so Wolverine was going to be the first one. Then they were going to have an X-Men Origins Magneto movie. And I think they were also going to do like a Cyclops and a Storm one as well at one point. But what happened was Wolverine bombed, and then they decided, okay, let's do First Class instead. And they folded in a lot of the script from X-Men Origins Magneto into the First Class script.
That makes complete sense. Because that scene of First Class where he's, Nazi hunting in Argentina or something, terrific scene.
Best scene of the movie.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Yeah. Especially I really like the train. The train scenes. I like the training scenes as well, right? Where Banshee's learning how to fly and Havoc's learning his powers. Like, I really like that's probably that's one of the only like real we're training and learning to use our powers scenes.
Yeah. I mean, we also get in Last Stand, we get that danger room sequence at the beginning, but it's kind of truncated. But yeah, I like that training montage as well, and it would have been nice to see a little bit more of that. Yeah, I mean, I like First Class, but and also I don't like, as much as I like Kevin Bacon's performance as Sebastian Shaw. Doesn't feel at all like Sebastian Shaw the character. It just feels like Proto Magneto.
Sebastian Shaw in the film is not great, and his powers are not really explained that well. And yeah, Kevin Bacon didn't really. He was just cashing in the check.
But also in this movie, I really like what they did with Jean. I thought Jean was. This is where Famke Janssen really kind of nailed Jean for me, and I think she did it perfectly. What'd you guys think of her performance?
I agree. I think she can play Jean. She did a really good job. And if there was an opportunity and a way for her to come back, they should give it to her. I think her performance in this one it's gonna be hard to top when they inevitably recast the character.
I really enjoyed Famke as Jean Grey. She's great. The only thing that I would say is that I would like to see a little bit, like, I always look at Jean Grey as being, super powerful, but also really maternal. She's a maternal character. For all those years, it was just her and the boys. And she's kind of like the mother figure in a way for all of her friends. And I don't see a lot of that really. Like, you see her a little bit with the kids, but not really. I would like to see a little bit more of that. But I thought, her big fight scene with Cyclops was really, really great. She put a lot of emotion into that as well. I like the scene at the end when she sacrifices herself. Who could say anything bad about Famke Janssen? She's great.
Yeah, I think that maternal stuff. I think they gave more of that to Storm actually in that scene when she's like finding
Yeah.
the kids on the monitors.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's a good point. Um, but yeah, the fight scenes in this movie too. Like I love that the mansion fight scene is probably the best. That and the
Yeah.
Nightcrawler scene are probably the best action scenes in this whole movie. Like it's
Yes,
just
we get
we
to see
see.
Wolverine actually go berserker.
It's funny
Mhm.
because I remember in interviews, Hugh Jackman was saying, it's like people were asking him, people were saying, like, I want to see Wolverine really cut loose. Like, you get to see it in this movie. And I'm like, yeah, you're just saying that. And then I watched the movie and I'm like, oh, fuck, he was right. He really does get to cut
Mhm.
loose.
They
Although
said they
that,
wanted to push it as far as they could with the rating, and
Mhm.
they did. I think even like when you watch the other Wolverine films now with the R rating, the only difference with the way Wolverine is in this one was that there's no blood.
Yeah.
right,
Even
I
when
was
he's
gonna
like
say,
stabbing
yeah.
them in the feet and in the chest and whatever, there's no blood. But the actual
Mhm.
viciousness and his like ruthlessness of going crazy and screaming, that's all R rated.
Well, I mean, that
I do
first
think
scene
my
when he grabs the guy who's shooting at Bobby and like,
yeah.
and just like, the wound heals and the claws come out and just shoves him up and just jams him right in and screams like, holy fuck.
Yeah, and
Mhm.
Bobby's like scared.
Yeah.
And then they see him go crazy, and all three of them are scared. And he's like, "Come on!" And they're just like, "Okay,
Mhm.
we will go with
The
you."
blood, the bloodlessness of it felt so weird in this viewing too, and I think I just had canon that to say like maybe the claws like cauterized the wound, and that's why there's no blood because it's so weird. Like you right, Perry, like he would stab, he would tear, like there that whole place should be like dripping in
Mhm.
blood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like,
maybe it's the fire claws they briefly gave him in the comics.
I guess.
Oh,
No, but there was the only instance of blood was when he was being skewered by poor Lady Deathstrike. And I
Yeah.
guess it's an injury. Like I wonder why they picked that particular scene to. Maybe it's unavoidable at that point. Like okay, we really have to
also,
show it.
when in the mansion when they first go in, he gets that cut on his face, right? And it
Yeah,
slowly
yeah.
heals just
hmm
before he gets pissed off, and that's what triggers the berserker
hmm
I love.
rage.
Yeah, it gave us a nice shot for all the kids and using their powers, and that Colossus cameo. It's still like up except for the Deadpool movies. That's the best Colossus has been in the movies. Was just that
Yeah,
one brief
Yeah.
yeah,
scene.
yeah. hmm Oh, and
Although I
then
didn't
he.
like when he goes, he's like, Colossus is like, I can help you, and he's like, no, help them, and he thinks about it for just like 1 second, and then he turns around and goes with the kids. But I thought he thought about it for like not even half a second. It was just like
Mhm.
boom, done. I thought, oh, you could have pondered it for just
I
And
remember in
one
the
and a
then
half
theater
seconds.
when he said that in the theater. I'm just like, yes, go with them, go with them. We can see more Colossus action.
Yeah,
Fastball special, y'all.
Yeah.
Yeah, but also he was drawing, which again is another nice
Yeah.
subtle touch of like the fans will get it. Like it's an amusing scene, but also we get it. So that was
Mhm.
very cool.
Mhm. Yeah.
do you think perhaps the writers of the film were true X-Men fans, whereas in some of the other films they were perhaps not?
I think I'm
Because
trying to
those little
remember.
Easter eggs, now that we're mentioning them, there's a lot.
There's so many.
So
Yeah.
And
Zach
there's a lot
Penn,
that doesn't cost money, right? It didn't
right?
cost money to put the names of the other mutants on the computer files in the government
hmm
facility, or to have Colossus be drawing.
hmm
Now Zach Penn wrote one of the drafts. I know that Zach Penn is a huge comic book fan, so that definitely tracks. David Hayter, who wrote the first one, he also wrote a draft of this too. And then Michael Dougherty and Dan Harris were brought in to rewrite it. I don't think Dougherty and Harris are big fans. I think they're probably familiar with some stuff, but I think Zach Penn was probably the biggest comic book fan of the bunch, if I'm remembering correctly.
I thought Joss Whedon had something to do with the first
He
film.
had some uncredited rewrites on the first film. Yeah.
And the part that stayed was that unfortunate storm line, I believe.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Which would have landed well in a different movie, but it was not that movie.
It did not work. No. I mean, just everything
Mhm.
about Storm in
Would
these
it
movies
would
just
it have
doesn't add
landed
well.
though?
I think it. I mean, I can see that fitting in like a Buffy episode, like if the tone was different. But the Halle Berry's delivery was just.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what
Oh,
happens to a toad when it's struck? It's like It was just the wrong register for
It
that
was
line
bad.
to be
It was definitely
delivered.
bad, but
Yeah.
I don't think that anyone could have delivered it any better. I think they're both as bad as each other there. But I've read that, speaking of Kitty Pryde, apparently that Whedon based all of Buffy on Kitty,
Yeah, he said that
Yeah.
which
Kitty was a huge inspiration for him for Buffy.
Mhm. Which
Um,
went full
I'm sur-
circle when he wrote the X-Men.
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, which is why he
Hmm.
did, which is why she was such a focus of his astonishing run.
Hmm.
Um, I love too the scene in
But
this movie is when Wolverine's in Bobby's house and he's sniffing for beer.
Hmm.
they're like, "What are you a teacher of?" And he's like, art."
Art. Yeah.
But I love that too when Bobby says this is Professor Logan. Even Logan's like, what?
What? Although, he could really should physical education. That may have been more appropriate. Karate. I don't know.
That police scene as well, when they're in the house, is another really good action piece as well. Not as much
Yeah.
of a standout as the prison breakout and the White House breakout, but still a really, really good scene.
Hmm.
Especially when they shoot Wolverine and then afterwards the cop who shot him watches Wolverine get up and walk into the jet and he's like, what the fuck?
Yeah, the bullets coming out.
Hmm.
Oh, also
And Rogue
speaking
too
of
gets a moment.
Pyro
Yeah.
too, I want to mention too that scene when Magneto is talking to him on the X Jet and he says to him, he's like, "What's your name?" and he says John, and Magneto's like, "No, what's your real name?" And I really like that. I think this is the first time that was established in either movies or comic books that mutant the code names are not like superhero names, but they're like a mutant name, like a way to honor the mutant heritage as opposed to the name you were given by the humans.
Hmm.
Yeah, a mutant culture.
Yeah. And just everything about Ian McKellen in this as Magneto, I think he really elevated his performance. He really felt like the Magneto from the comics, more so in this movie than I think in any others. Like he had that
Hmm.
whole regal feel to him.
Ian McKellen's such a fantastic actor, and in the UK, he's been famous and revered for such a long time, especially in the theatre.
Mhm.
And I think he's done a lot of Shakespearean work, and he obviously had that framework in mind when he was filming when he was playing Magneto. And I think in this film in particular, even more so than the first, that you can really see that regalness and that interpretation, and it works so well.
I mean, that breakout scene is just spectacular, right? That's just I could
Hmm.
picture that playing out exactly in the same way in the comic books. Like he just, he just grabs him, he lifts him up, draws all the iron that Mystique injected into the guy, and then he
Hmm.
floats, and he's just standing on that floating disc and just moving slowly through the scene. That works so well.
Yeah, and I think what was really cool in this film is they advanced the mythos a little bit in the
Mhm.
sense of Magneto and Mystique are no longer really the villains. They're not the antagonists. Like the title says, like they're all together, um,
Right.
fighting against this other villain, which is a cool and logical progression, which unfortunately got dashed in the third film. But
Yeah.
I would have liked to see them continue that more, like this notion that like yeah, not all mutants are the same. There's like these different ideologies at play and different politics, but at the end of the day, really, like they would have to band together to combat like other different, more dangerous threats. Like I really just enjoy it too, and I think one of the reasons I love the Krakoa era so much is this notion of like, you know, putting not putting aside their differences. I mean, obviously they're still there, but sort of finding a way to work together to protect themselves
Mhm.
is an interesting thing to see.
I agree, and I agree, but with a slight different angle. Where I think one of the things that makes the X-Men great is that the protagonists and the antagonists, they both have the same goal, right? And that is
Mhm.
Hmm.
to protect and look after the mutant minority. They just have different ideas about what's the best way to achieve that. And the beauty of that is that they do clash against each other with those different ideals, but they're also going to be able to join together naturally against a common foe without it being too much like too forced. It's not. It doesn't have to be forced. It's a natural enemy. You're an enemy of my enemy is both our enemies, or whatever that phrase
The enemy of
is.
my enemy is my friend.
Yeah. And I think it
Yeah.
also speaks to, and it's really cool to see this notion of like, look, I mean, minority groups are not monolithic. Like they're not all the same. Like there's different groups of different people within these groups, and they may have different ideas about what to do about whatever problems they're facing. And I think that's really important to depict.
Yeah. I think also too that the politics in this movie, in some ways, they're more realistic than they are even in the comics. Like I thought you had mentioned earlier about the scene with the president saying the last thing we need is to see a mutant kid, the body of a mutant kid on the 6 o'clock news. In the comic books, they're like, yeah, fuck, throw giant robots at him, kill them all. But it's
I'm
like,
yeah.
they're a little bit more realistic at the time. It's like, look, we may want to persecute them, but we can't be obvious that we want to persecute them. So they're trying to find ways around that kind of stuff. So I thought
it's like an indictment of the times we're living in, where I'm like, how refreshing.
Oh,
yeah. How cool is that is a thing you're caring about. So cool. I love it. I love this ethical nastiness you're doing. Like, yes, that is what we should aim for. Love it. Fabulous. Thank you so much.
I mean, yeah, that's true. I was thinking that too when that scene came. I'm like, yeah, it would make more sense now if you had a president be like, yeah, just fucking kill them all.
Mm.
Oh, that's sad.
Yeah,
it is. It is.
All right. Well, that's a nice note to end this on.
Yeah, I was about to say, wow.
But anyway, I think
go out and vote, y'all.
Yeah. In retrospect, I mean, I still think this is my favorite of the team movies. If we're talking, adding in the Wolverine movies and the Deadpool movies, I think I would put this probably on par with the Deadpool movies, and then Logan would still be like the top one for me. But overall, like, I mean, this, even with some of the changes, I think this movie gets a lot more right than it gets wrong, and it still holds up. I mean, like you said, this movie's 20 years old this year. It still holds up very well.
Mm-hmm. I have to agree. I think this has inspired me to do another Days of Future Past rewatch to check in with my feelings to see what my number one is. But it's either number one or two for me. It holds up very well, and it's remarkable to me. Like, I don't know with you guys, but like, you see a movie 20 years ago, it provokes certain kinds of feelings, right? It may not hit the same way again. Mm-hmm. But like, I'm sorry, when she was doing that levitating plane thing with the water, I'm like, oh, it's the same kind of goosebumps. I'm feeling it again. That's weird because I'm old and like cynical now, and that doesn't happen to me anymore. I'm like, it's hitting me the same way. So I think that's a testament to how good that film is.
Oscar?
For me, it reinforced that my belief that people say that the MCU has to thank Robert Downey Jr. and Iron Man for being the success that it is, whereas I think that really it's X-Men 2 that it has to thank, because it is better than the first one, and it was the first superhero movie that was like rave reviewed by the critics and by the fans as well.
Yeah.
Became a big, huge commercial success. X-Men 1 was good and people enjoyed it, but X-Men 2 was great and people loved it. And rightfully so. It has stood the test of time. It's better than some of the films that are coming out even now. I would say a lot of the MCU films as well. I watch a lot more of the MCU films than the DC films. I haven't seen like Shazam or Black Adam or anything like that, but
Shazam is good. Black Adam, don't waste your time.
Shazam 2, also don't waste your time.
Oh, okay. I haven't seen that one yet. Although I did just see the new trailer for The Flash drop this morning, and that looks... Ezra Miller's a sociopath, but man, Michael Keaton looks so good in that movie.
Well, Ezra Miller is causing the studio such a headache. Such a headache. But I don't think we're going to see any Bryan Singer X-Men films again either.
No. I mean, yeah, he's a monster. So yeah, we're not seeing any more from him.
His career is pretty much over with now. But for his art, the films are great. And
Well, I
this
mean,
is
yeah, I mean, like
definitely
it's disappointing to say that also like one of the best. I mean, it's the same thing with Josh Whedon, right? He directed one of the greatest superheroes of all time with Avengers, but he's also a fucking monster. So, I mean, it's
yeah.
it's a similar thing with Singer too. But I am really curious to see what will happen now once they bring in mutants into the MCU and seeing how they work all this stuff in. And it'll also be interesting because they don't have to be as restricted as these movies
Right.
either felt they had to be, or maybe
Mhm.
because also Singer too wasn't a fan of the comics, so he didn't have that kind of mentality going into them as well. So it'll be really interesting to see what we do with someone who. And one thing about the MCU is they find people who really do love the source material. So I'm really
Um,
curious to see what we're going to get out of that.
what are your ideas, or maybe ideas or like wish list of like how should they do it? How do you want them to do it to
So
bring the mutants in?
I've said this a lot of times, and I still think this is the best way.
Hmm.
I'd start with the idea that mutants have always existed, but they've just been in like so many small numbers that they haven't even nobody. And like
Same.
maybe Nick Fury was working with Xavier Magneto transporting mutant refugees to
Hmm.
Krakoa or something like that, and
Hmm.
because Krakoa can move all around the place, it's never been able to be detected. But after the blip, like
Hmm.
in Endgame, Rocket says that it's ground zero for all this cosmic energy that's never been seen
Right.
before.
Yep.
Wanda got her powers jump started by the Mind Stone. So did Pietro. So that whole
Hmm.
idea that the Infinity Stone's cosmic energy has jump started mutation. So now, whereas
Right.
like maybe their grandchildren or their great grandchildren would have become mutants, now instead it's happening several generations earlier. And so there's this big
Mm.
explosion of mutant kind, and then you've got this conflict brewing between Xavier and Magneto. That's how I would do it, is to introduce the idea of mutants.
And I think so. I know it's been very divisive among the fans and the comics, but I think the whole notion of the resurrection technology is such a boon and a gift to the films, because once you do that, again, you're like free of restraints and you can say things like, why, indeed, yes, Magneto was in World War II. Here's why. Now, I don't know how that's going to land with movie fans, but I like it's
Yeah,
such a
it's really
gift.
hard for the origin, right?
Yeah. Because I mean, the time is a constraint, but I don't know if they're going to use that at all. But like, it's such
I
an
mean,
interesting way to sort of maybe
you could do
resolve
it.
that
I think you could do
problem.
it one of three ways. Either you could do it, like you said, you could use like the resurrection technology, or just
Hmm.
say that he's long lived because of his some secondary
Mutation.
Powers.
Oh
mutation or
well,
something like that.
Namor, they've already established, right? Like
Right,
he's a
exactly.
mutant and he's
Right,
lived
yeah,
like
yeah.
so long, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that too, that too.
Hmm.
Another way you could do it is what Miller did in the Ultimates, in the Ultimate X-Men, where he said that Magneto is the descendant of Holocaust survivors, is I think what was
Hmm.
kind of hinted at, instead of him actually
Hmm.
being in the Holocaust. Um, or the third option is you could just maybe not the Holocaust, but some other, you know,
Right.
genocidal event, like the a victim of the Serbian wars or something like that, or
Hmm.
anything like that. I mean, unfortunately, there's no shortage of human atrocities that
I
have
was gonna
happened
say, like,
in the
great,
modern day.
we have
So,
options, y'all. Thank you. Yeah, great. Hmm.
but I
Once
think the
again,
other
that's
thing I would do also is
pretty sad.
I would keep it. One of the things I would love to happen. I know this won't happen, but I would actually love to see them do like an X-Men series on Disney Plus. Be able to play around with more character stuff, and then save
Hmm.
like big set piece stuff for like an X-Men movie. So like cap off each
Yeah.
season or something like that with a big budget movie. I think would be really cool. They won't do that. I know they're not going to do that, but that would be a really cool way to play around with the character dynamics, really get to build up the casts and everything. Um, and I would have Wolverine off on his own, introduce Wolverine in a separate movie, and then bring him into the X-Men movies later so he doesn't have to be such a big focus. Those would probably be the big things I would do.
Hmm.
For me, I think they would be better off hitting it with the multiverse angle. I
Hmm.
don't know, as a comic book reader of 30 years that I have, I still can't reconcile in my head why people love the Avengers and hate the X-Men. And if you
Who are
gain
these?
your
Who are these?
powers some mystic way, then you're
Mm-hmm.
fine. But if you're
Mm-hmm.
born with it, then you're a mutie and we hate you, and just doesn't sit right. And I think general audiences won't really get that as well by putting the two of them together. I think I like the idea of them being multiversal and just having their own universe and interacting through Kang or something like that. I don't want them to all be together in one MCU.
That's why I think the
Oh,
Infinity Stones actually works for that, because they're the thing that brings about mutants is this thing that almost destroyed humanity. So I think
mhm.
that's a good way to kind of instill that fear into the public.
I think your way is good, but I think the general movie going public is going to have a hard time reconciling the anti-mutant hysteria and the love of Avengers.
I mean, you never know, because there was one point when people would say that the general movie-going audience couldn't reconcile the idea of the multiverse. So, and now we've got tons of multiverse
Yeah.
stuff.
That's true. I look forward to being proven wrong.
I hope I'm proven right. But I mean, I know
I guess
we are getting some multiverse stuff, at least, because we got Jackman coming back up in the Deadpool 3, so that's going to happen.
And we've already seen it in the Multiverse of Madness. I mean,
Yeah,
Charles
with
had a
the Professor
cameo.
X, that's right. Yeah.
But I was gonna say, like, well, they're planning a. I don't know if you guys have heard, but like in San Diego, they're having an actual live Hellfire Gala, which may just be a bunch of cosplayers larping around, which is not a terrible thing. But I just like, is this like a test thing? What are they doing? Like, it just floors me. I'm like, is this reality that I'm living in? Like, never in a million years would I have thought like, okay, this is a thing. This is a thing they're doing. Crazy.
Okay. All right. Well, that does it for this episode, guys. Thanks so much for coming back. This is a lot of fun to talk about X2 with you. But why don't you tell people where they can find your stuff? Oscar, you can start with
you. Can find me on Twitter. I do some ramblings every now and then. It's ODAT220.
And Pat?
You can find me on Tumblr at Perfect Fabric J Killing Machine, and if you want more X-Men content, I'm also on another podcast called Krakoan Exports, where we are currently reading through and talking about the comics coming out in the current era of the X-Men.
Okay, great. And also go back and listen to E for Evolution, examining Grant Morrison's X-Men that the three of us did together. It was a fun podcast. We covered the entire Morrison run from 114 up until 154, I think it was the issues. And yeah, it was. I recently re-listened to the last of those episodes, and it such a lot of fun talking about those. Really gave me a new appreciation to go back and re-examine those issues with you guys. And so you guys should definitely check that out. I think you'll enjoy it. But also you can check out superherocinephiles.com is the website. Super Cinema Pod is our Twitter and Instagram handles. And if you sign up for the Patreon page for as little as $1 a month, you get these episodes a week in advance. Plus you get access to the Superhero Cinephiles Book Club, where we talk about comic books and graphic novels about once a month. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. If you enjoy the Superhero Cinephiles, then you'll also love my companion podcast, the Superhero Cinephiles Book Club. All my Patreon subscribers get access to this exclusive podcast where I review superhero comics and graphic novels. Not sure what comics you want to read next or what you should dive into? I've got you covered on that. I'll be doing reviews, recommendations, and also talking to you about useful entry points if you're interested in reading some comics but don't know where you should start. Plus, you'll get access to all episodes of the main show a week before everyone else. On all of this for as little as just $1 a month. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/supercinemapod and you can sign up at any subscription amount to get started. Thanks so much for your support, and please don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you for listening. And as always, good night, good evening. God bless.